So the last 2 weeks, we've been obviously talking about ethics. And the first week, we talked about the idea of universal ethics. What do we owe? If money was no issue, what do we owe every person in the world by virtue of the fact that they are human beings? And what do we owe our own people, our own community, our own family? And what happens in a world of limited resources? How do you make decisions about how to allocate your tzedakah dollars, your time, your money? One of the things when my middle son Zachary was in college, this was a conversation that we had pretty consistently for 4 years, which was how he would say, how could I even ever have the right to eat a candy bar when people in the world are starving? Like, how could anybody, allow themselves anything above really their basic needs when people in the world are starving? Shouldn't we take all of that extra and shouldn't we donate it? And I actually used to say to him, that sounds very Christian to me. Like, that's not very Jewish. In Judaism, there are a lot of texts about that we are allowed, that God gave us all of these wonderful things to enjoy. But there is at the high, he actually does allow himself some nice things. Like he didn't become like a monk, but that at its heart, there is a certain, I felt it was a little overboard, though he probably felt I was, a bad person because there were things I wasn't willing to give up to, help other people that were starving. But at some basic level, there is something about that question, right? What is the balance between, how we take care of ourselves, how we take care of others, and how we take care of the world? One of the things, and I think I said this, these classes kind of run together because I'm teaching, ethics like simultaneously and in the morning and the evening. But if you've noticed, and I hope you have, that I've been sending out information about how to help Jewish refugees from the Ukraine, and specifically members of the conservative movement. Now, every Ukrainian refugee needs our help. Every Jewish refugee needs our help. And then there are members of really our own very specific community. So when I read stories about Jews from the conservative movement being resettled in Berlin and brought to a conservative synagogue in Berlin, where they're meeting, other members of the community, there's a sense that it's even beyond the idea of tzedakah and providing for their specific needs. It's also bringing them into a community of like-minded people who are their peers. And so it's less a charity project for the poor refugees and more of a sense of what do you owe and how do you take care of people in your own community and give them the comfort of, like, here's our Siddur, here's our prayer service that you're very familiar with, here are other Jewish people that are like you. And while there are, there's a myriad of ways, endless ways to think about how we help all of the refugees. At some basic level, we know we can't help everybody. So how do you, determine? And that's sort of an age-old question, and it's with us as relevant as ever. The irony of Jewish history, of course, is that the refugees that probably have it the best right now are Jewish refugees, because if they want to go to Israel, they can go to Israel and they'll be set up with, getting their basic needs met as they make Aliyah and actually become citizens of the country that they're moving to, which is not going to be true. All of these other countries that are letting in oh, okay. Sorry, I just got a chat. I will answer that question. I just was asked, what is the synagogue, the conservative synagogue in Berlin? I can't pronounce it, but I will send you the contact information for that after we get off tonight. but they should go. That would be really nice. So they may need to let people know they're coming in advance because of security issues. So I will send you the email of the rabbi who's a personal friend. All these other countries that are taking in refugees, there's a time limit for how long they can stay. They're not offering, I mean, they're offering them shelter and food and protection and all of that, but they're not offering them citizenship. So these people, these poor refugees who hope that they'll be, I mean, they want to go home. They don't really want to stay in these other countries. They really want to be able to go home. And hopefully, God willing, there will be a home for them, to go back to. But Israel's offering citizenship, right? You can stay and under the law of return, be citizens. So there's this unbelievable irony in Jewish history. Maybe some of you have heard me say this because I said this Tuesday morning as well, but I have this fantasy. I want to write, this is the letter I want to write to my great-grandparents. Like, dear great-grandparents, Russia invaded Ukraine. Oh, by the way, the Soviet Union fell. And President Zelensky, who's Jewish, has been in contact with the Prime Minister of Israel, who a couple of weeks ago traveled to the Kremlin to try to negotiate peace. Your thoughts? It's like we're in a terrible time, but from a Jewish point of view, it's just mind-boggling. And I know for many of us, we recognize the names of many of these places that people are fleeing from because our ancestors fled from these very same places. So tonight, really, the issue that we will be really looking at is this issue of how do you determine because all resources are limited, what does Jewish law say to us about how we determine where our money goes? So, so this is from the Tosefta. I'm sure none of you have ever heard of this book, the Tosefta. So the Talmud is made up of two books, the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Mishnah is really sort of the first layer of codifying Jewish law, beginning the process of codifying Jewish law in about 200 of the Common Era. And then the Talmud was additional, I don't even know, you can't really call it a code because it's not like this is a definition of what Jewish law is, but it's a recording of multi-dialogues about trying to determine what Jewish law is. And the Tosefta means added or extra. And Tosefta were laws that didn't get into the body of that work, but still are there as rabbinic sources that influence the interpretation of Jewish law. So what do you do in the case of a cistern which belongs to the people of a town, right? So if you think about how did people get water, if you live near a river or a body of water, but there would be a common well. We read about this even in the Torah, right? That there's all these episodes at the well. So towns would dig a well, and the well would be the property of the entire town. So what if there's only enough water for the people of the town? But there are other people that live in the vicinity, but they don't live in the town, but they live near enough by that they could come and take water for the well, but there's not enough. How do you ration or allocate the water of the well? There are different ways you could do it, right? There's, I don't know, I'm not good. There's 10 gallons of water, there's 10 townspeople, and there's 10 people outside the town. So you could say, well, then everybody gets a half a gallon. But that's not that's not what this text is going to teach us.
Debbie, can I just interrupt for a second?
Sure.
Just for clarification, what we're reading here is the opinion of a particular rabbi, the halachic law coming out of the Mishnah. Can you just?
Okay. So what happens in the Mishnah and in the Gemara and in the Tosefta is, and we're going to see this in a minute in this text, is very often there are people that disagree. So you have different rabbis that don't agree how the law is applied. And sometimes you're left with it hanging and they don't come to a conclusion, which is why it's not a code. Would be, this is what the law is. Very often the Mishnah and the Gemara leave it hanging because there are multiple opinions. But when the Mishnah or the Tosefta, as it's doing here, starts out in the case of a cistern, right? They're not saying Rabbi Yossi says this and Rabbi somebody else says that. That sometimes it's it's called the anonymous voice. And the anonymous voice is usually, if it's not given a specific name, is usually that is what's usually followed, right? That seems to be like everybody thinks this, and then there's one or two people that might disagree. So usually when there's that anonymous, everybody thinks this, that's usually the way Jewish law is determined. So we're going to see that somebody disagrees about how some of this law is applied. Did that answer your question? Okay. So you have a cistern, it's got a limited amount of water, and you've got more people in the surrounding area that have no other water source. The townspeople have precedence in the drinking water over the others. So you don't have to provide water from your well if your own people that live in the town won't have enough. You are allowed to fulfill, you are required really to fulfill the needs of the people living in the town. Now, this isn't to say, and they can, you know, throw a pool party with it, right? This isn't, you can't, you know, waste it or be extravagant with it. One of really my most embarrassing adult moments, we were on vacation in Israel, and we were on a kibbutz that was on the ocean, which was lovely, lovely, lovely. The kids are on the sea, on the Mediterranean Sea. The kids were at the beach all day, and they came back and they were sandy and dirty or whatever. And there were outdoor showers, and we were letting our kids not only just quickly rinse off, but kind of play in the water. And some Israelis, as they, you know, tend to do, came up to us and said, "You're wasting water." And then we felt like really idiots because, you know, this was a long time ago before I was as aware of being, you know, environmentally aware as I am today, and also probably, you know, growing up in the Midwest where we didn't have to think about a water scarcity. But Israelis have dealt with water scarcity for a long time. And actually some of them, we're talking about environmental ethics next week, but some of the most exciting innovations in water are taking place of Israel. Israel reuses something like 90% of its wastewater, it desalinates, all of these things, but no, it wasn't doing any of those things at that time other than drip irrigation. And I felt ashamed, right, for not thinking about what this would look like, what this would be in Israel, to just let water run as if, you know, it was an unlimited resource. So a cistern is going to be limited, right? This is a desert, it's arid, there isn't enough water. And so the needs of the town people, the needs of the town people take precedence over everybody else. What about your animals? How does that rank? Because of course your animals isn't just your dog that's your pet or your cat that's your pet. Your animals are your livelihood. Your animals are what probably, provide some of your food, provide your livelihood, carry your things for you, plow your fields. And so where do the animals rank in this? So the lives of others have precedence over the animals. So this anonymous voice says, first the water goes to the townspeople. And then the question is, well, your animals or the people that are the suburbanites, whoever these people are that aren't part of the town. And the anonymous voice says, the people of the other town take precedence over the animals. But Rabbi Yossi says, so he disagrees, the townspeople's animals have precedence before the lives of others, because you're in some ways, I mean, I would assume he would reason that your animals are your food and your livelihood, and without them, you won't be able to survive. So he feels like first the people of the town, then the animals of the town. The animals of the townspeople are the animals of others. The animals of the town people have precedence over the animals of others. So that's pretty clear. If the people of the town have precedence, then of course the animals of the town have precedence. Drinking water for the others or the laundry of the townspeople. The lives of others have precedence over their laundry, right? So you're just going to have to go around in dirty, stinky clothes so that other people have water. But Rabbi Yossi says the laundry of the townspeople comes before the lives of others. The laundry of the townspeople or laundry of the others, the laundry of the townspeople comes first. So Rabbi Yossi is the outlying voice. The law is not like Rabbi Yossi, because as I said, when there's the anonymous voice, it's always, and everybody agrees. And then you've got one nudnik outlier, because this is a Jewish community, right? So you've got one nudnik outlier. But the text, Sima, one second, I'll call on you in a second. But the text is very clear. Your physical needs of drinking water come first. But the needs of the other people of the other vicinity, or the other place, wherever that is, comes before your animals. And certainly the animals everybody's animals comes before anybody gets to do their laundry. Sima?
What I was a little, I'd like a little more explanation. Nowhere on the pages before, or kind of the next page, is any particular, is anything attributed to a particular person. And if you have this anonymous voice, and who might this be, or how does this one rabbi get cited to be whether it's opposing voice or the agreeing voice, whatever. I just don't know, if I were just reading this on my own, not having a strong background in all this, how this particular thing got in this important discussion.
The truth is, we don't know, right? We don't know. Whoever, our ancestors looked at all of this really differently than we did, that we do. Like, nobody today wouldn't want their name on something, right? If you went to all the trouble of editing this work, like 20 volumes, you'd want people to know it was you. They had a different view of this. Their view is it actually gave it more credibility. The fact that, I don't know if they would say that they believed they were speaking in the name of God, but I think to a certain extent, they kind of did. Like, they really felt that this was, that they weren't really important. It was like coming through them in a different sort of way. And so for us, we don't know who wrote the prayers in the Siddur. We do not know one name of one person. We don't know who wrote the Amidah. Like, this prayer that we've been saying for 2,000 years, that traditionally Jews say 3 times a day and 4 times on Shabbat, we don't know who wrote it. Like, it's kind of inconceivable to us, like, to think about. We certainly, if people want to talk about who edited the Torah, and scholars believe the Torah was edited, we don't know who they are either. So it was a different ethos in how you transmitted the tradition. And the oral tradition, which this was originally part of before it got written down, was seen as coming from a direct line from Sinai. And so not giving it a name was seen as given more authenticity, that it was like the outgrowth of this voice from Sinai. So we don't know who edited the Talmud, or I'm sure it was more than one person. We don't know who. We can't even pinpoint, scholars can't pinpoint it. It's written within a few hundred years, but they can't really pinpoint that. Now the Talmud is full of rabbis' names. As is the Mishnah. So this source was actually a little bit rare in that there was only one name. There's usually multiple names. But the other thing that if you there's a saying in Hebrew, like those who know, you could see multiple names. This rabbi says this, and this rabbi says this, and it looks as if they're arguing with each other. But if you dig a little deeper, you can find out that in many of these discussions, one rabbi lived 100 years ago, and another, they weren't all alive at the same time. So they actually weren't having a real discussion, and somebody just, wrote it all down and put it on the page. Somebody curated it. Somebody brought those voices together to create, like, well, this rabbi says this, and 100 years later, this rabbi says this. Let's just bring them all together on the page. And the way Jewish law used to be interpreted in ancient times is the rabbi, the scholar, would, open the book of the Talmud, would look at all of these people and what they said, would understand that there's a hierarchy, that actually the ones. It's funny, like, you might think that the latest voice, the newest voice, would be the most authoritative. but actually in Judaism, it's the oldest voice. So if you can find a source that if you're in the Gemara and you can find a source that dates back to the Mishnah to support you, that's better.
Do any of these, if there's multiple rabbis quoted, whatever I want to say it, or just one, do any of them have any backstory of this particular town or this particular, group or something than just their names?
They each have their own backstory. We don't always know that much about them, but we know a little bit about them. But we don't know, like, is this town a theoretical town? Are they talking about a theoretical town that's actually like every town, right? Every town has a cistern. Every town has limited, look, I mean, in some ways, this is a political debate that's with us, healthcare. Shouldn't it be the right of every citizen of the United States of America to have health care? But when people argue against that right, which I believe it's a right, it's an economic argument. Like, nobody says they don't deserve to have health care because they're, subhuman, right? What people will argue about, like, well, yeah, people have a right to have health care, but who's going to pay for it? And so the debate becomes a very economic debate about, are we willing to pay for it? Are taxpayers willing to pay for it? Every night I see on the news, and this is actually annoying me, about, how much are you willing to pay for gas, to support the Ukraine? So, on some level, well, anything, I'm going to work, whatever, charge me whatever. What I actually hate about that coverage is I actually think that this is like war profiteering by our CEOs and our oil companies. And I wish that the news would actually mention that. And so then I'm not willing to pay anything. Like, I'm not willing to just pay anything or everything to, so that the CEOs, the rich can get richer. But if I felt somehow that me paying, $6 at the gas tank, $6 a gallon at the gas tank was actually really helping the Ukrainians, it would be hard to say, like, I really want to go back to paying half that amount. So these are real issues. These are real issues in real societies of how we decide how things are allocated. So what's important about this source is the idea that you take care of your own first. Right? You take care, your obligation is to take care of your own first. Let me stop sharing this for a minute. I heard such an interesting lecture. It was a long time ago now. It was probably, I have this thing where I always say it's somewhere in the last 2 to 7 years, this thing happened to me, because I can't remember, was it 2 years ago? Was it 7 years ago? But now, because of COVID, I mostly know it wasn't in the last 2 years that it happened. So it was either pre-COVID or during COVID, this thing happened. So long in the distant past of pre-COVID, I heard a talk by a gentleman by the name of Noam Zion. He's a Jewish scholar. He teaches at Hartman. He's an amazing teacher. And he talked about different views of philanthropy. And if you could categorize it, he talked about Christian views, Jewish views, and ancient Greek Hellenistic views. And in those societies, what was the ideal form of charity? So he claims, and he had lots of sources, Judaism, and well, what is the highest form of charity or tzedakah in Judaism? Deanna?
Isn't it when both the donor and the recipient don't know who each other are?
Yes, but I wasn't thinking about that. The type,
Okay.
let me rephrase.
Oh,
the
okay.
Type of giving.
Type of giving would be helping somebody to find a job so they can support.
Exactly. So in Judaism, the highest form of tzedakah is, I don't know, bringing refugees over and making them citizens and helping them get set up on their feet, right? I mean, that's what we're saying, right? Help them get set up and get jobs, and they can be self-sufficient. Christian charity. Want to take a stab at this? What's the highest form of Christian charity? Who are in Christianity? Who do you give to?
Church.
The church, but what else? They actually have a phrase.
The most abject poverty.
Yes, the
I
abject,
paid attention.
right? The abject poor. Your responsibility is to take care of the poorest people. And if the poorest people are in Africa, then that's where your money goes. And listen, I did a big redecorating project for my kitchen, and I kept thinking I was so excited about it and blah, 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 you know, as one is. But pre-COVID, I was in Uganda, and I was in the Jewish village in Uganda, and I saw what, let's say the kitchen was a little hut outside the house with a pot and a pan and a fire pit. And, you know, you think about, I complain because I don't have enough counter space in my kitchen, you know, like, so in Christianity, a lot of, you know, Oxfam, you think about a lot of their tzedakah goes to the most needy in the world. That's where, you know, if you have a hierarchy, the poorest in the world. Greek, anybody want to take a stab at where did Greek people give their money? The ideal was to give your money to build libraries, museums, theaters, institutions, right, that would better all of society. So the reality is we probably give to all of those things, right? Living in the United States and being I don't know if we're still allowed to be a melting pot, but to be a melting pot of all of those ideas, you could make a case for each of those, right? Why you should give to the most needy versus the people of your town that maybe are more well off, or why you should, you know, have a microloan that will allow somebody to buy a goat that can milk the goat and buy their kids shoes, and then their kids can walk to school. And that, or that a society, we need hospitals and museums and universities, and we want all of those things in society. So in reality, in the United States and in every Western country, all of those things are braided together and they're all important, and we make decisions about how we give to all of those things. But at its purest levels, though, each of those things find a different rank order in various traditions. And I just thought that was, you know, that was so very, very interesting. Okay, so your responsibility is first and foremost to take care of your own. So, okay, that's very nice. But okay, so this is a little bit of a later source, Tana Debay Eliyahu. So this is a source that I actually, to be honest, I don't know. It's after the Talmud. So it's a little bit later. So I don't know if it's like 6th, 7th, 8th century, whereas the Mishnah is, you know, like 2nd century. So it's hundreds of years later. So, okay, we understand that we have to take care of our town. So if someone has food in their home and wishes also to give to charity and support others from his resources, then how should they do so? First, one supports one's parents. If there is a surplus, then support your siblings. If there is a surplus, then support your extended family. If there's a surplus, then your neighborhood. If a surplus, then in your city. And if there's a surplus, then the rest of the Jewish people. So your first priority is to take care of your parents, then your siblings, right? Then your extended family, then your town, and then the Jewish people. So there's something that's really, I think probably something that we should note, which is we live in a world of material excess that our ancestors could have never imagined. Like we think about limited resources of how can we help 2 million refugees and oh my God, I can't help 2 million refugees. But most of us don't live in a world where where our parents have nothing and we can't help them, which was the reality of most of human society until very recently, and is the reality in many, many, many places in the world. So, but what if you only have a very limited amount? And you only have just a little bit more than you can give, you know, to take care of your own needs? Who are you obligated to give it to? you're obligated to support your own family. There's actually, I asked this on Tuesday morning in the class. I don't know if anybody, Rose is on, so maybe she could do this for us again. She did this for us Tuesday morning. But there's a Yiddish curse. There's a Yiddish curse, and the curse goes something like, may you be wealthy and be the only person in your family that has money. So, you know, I don't speak Yiddish, but I'm told Yiddish curses were very, are very, you know, whimsical, I guess, or, you know, I don't know if that's even the right word. So yeah, so what happens if you're the only person in your family that has money? You're going to be people are going to be coming to you all the time, and you're going to have to help them all the time. And I guess the curses that could be, you know, very, very annoying. So your obligation first is to your own household. And, you know, as I said, we have, you know, we have wealth that the letter that I wrote to my great grandparents about Zelensky and Prime Minister Bennett, the way my lifestyle would probably be I can't even imagine how foreign it would be to them. I'm sure you all have family stories like this in your family, which is, you know, I didn't know my great grandmother. I'm named for her. She came over from Warsaw with 2 little boys. Her husband came first, worked, left her alone in Warsaw with 2 little boys until he made enough money, until he could bring her here. I don't know how many years that was that she was here, but my grandmother, who was her daughter-in-law, told me her entire life she hid bread all over the house. And my grandmother would come and find moldy bread and all of this and throw it out and say to her, well, I'll buy you bread. But that none of us can imagine, right? The fear of being that hungry, that it could be taken away from you, that there's never a sense of enough because you've been hungry like that. Deanna?
Okay, so this brings 2 thoughts to mind. One of them is, on more than one occasion, I will share, many of them have been in the Am Yisrael Sanctuary, when you've got all these little kids dancing around with Mr. Sherman, AKA the Pied Piper, leading them. There have been more than one time that moment brings me to tears, because what I want to do is write to my grandmother and say, if you could have known this when you were in Auschwitz, would it have made this time a little bit, you know, to know that that really isn't the end, that not only is it not the end, but you're having little kids dancing.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, one of the things we're talking about here is privilege. And I know the privilege is a really woke word right now, but we literally just tonight had this conversation with another friend as well, that what you're talking about when you're talking about our ancestors seeing the way that we live now, and the privilege to, I'm using it in the traditional sense, the privilege to be able to decide where we give our tzedakah, and to be able to say that we're able to give it to not just our family, but our friends and our community and institutions. That's a privilege that we have. And I think many of us, at least on the Zoom call, don't take for granted, because those same grandparents and parents and great grandparents, they made the choices that they did specifically to allow us to have that privilege. And I think that, you know, you've talked many times that we're not white. Our experience is not the white experience. And I think that when immigrants come to work their little tushes off so that their descendants can have a better life from them, because who, you know, what doctor from another country is going to uproot their family to come here to work cleaning houses or some of the other menial jobs that doctors from other countries have to work? They do it to allow us to then be able to have this privilege and then share it and be able to have the conversation we're having right now. And I just wanted to share it because it just.
Yeah, I'm glad, you know, this is what I say about privilege, right? Because, you know, I don't like the term white privilege. I don't. So let's just, we don't have to spend a lot of time talking about that, but there is no doubt that we have an unbelievable amount of privilege. An unbelievable amount of privilege. And yes, our grandparents and great grandparents worked really, really, really hard to give us this privilege. But I guess these texts are an example of this. I don't need a social justice movement that's 2 years old lecturing to me what I'm supposed to do with this privilege. I have a Masoret, a tradition that's thousands of years old, that's guiding me on what to do when I have privilege. And these are some of the sources we're looking at when we're looking at Jewish ethics. Our sources are ancient sources that say to us, you've got responsibilities in the world. And because you have responsibilities in the world, you got to figure out how to apply it. Do you apply it to your townspeople, to the other townspeople, to your parents, to the strangers? Like, what do you do with it? If you've got any, look at this text. You have the littlest bit of surplus, and you know that you need to give it somewhere. Where do you give it? So that's what I say. It's not that we don't have privilege. We haven't. The other day, my car died in the parking lot at the Half Inn after I was coming out from meeting somebody for lunch. Called Brian. In 5 minutes, he was in the parking lot. He jumped my car. I drove home. On my way home, I called my mechanic. We have a great relationship. He said, I'll come, just drive your car home and I'll come get it and take a look at it. 40 minutes after this incident, he had already had my car in the shop. Like, this is unbelievable privilege. And I didn't have to worry about what the bill was going to be, or how I was going to take the bus to work the next day, or how I wouldn't be able to. Like, of course we have privilege, but we also have a tradition that tells us our responsibilities. Yeah, Sima, now we'll look at some more sources.
I know we're talking about, we switched to privilege, but the other thing is too, my parents lived through the Depression, and as a young child or a teenager or whatever, unless you live through something, whether you're widowed or divorced, or unless you've had that experience, my mother used to hide food all the time, and other things too. And we didn't have a lot even, but everything obviously was going to be better for me and go to me and so forth. But part of that privilege is also the reality of not being able, it's a separate issue, but not being able to get out of that mindset of living through it and not having that. And so, as a younger person, of course, I didn't understand the full impact of it. And I thought, well, this was silly because we had a house and we had some food, and I couldn't have that same feeling of it being a part of me and meaningful.
Look, I mean, we're all like, to a certain extent. That's why I was laughing at myself for like complaining about not having enough like counter space in my kitchen, and being in Uganda and seeing people that didn't have a kitchen. It's hard to hang on to that. Like, it's hard to hang on to really just how privileged, we are, which is why the drumbeat of Judaism of what we're supposed to do, and how we're supposed to take care of each other. Okay, so now we've had all these texts. Actually, before I share this, we've had all these texts that talk about the priority of giving your own townspeople, your own family. Okay, so it's all good. What's the downside? What's the problem? Well, we're going to look at a text that brings up like, okay, this is all very well and good, but then what? So the Aruch HaShulchan is what we would call a much later source, like 1800s. So what happened over time is, over time, this ability to have scholars that pored over the Talmud and looked at all of the different references to your problem and then came up with an answer for how to apply it, that type of scholarship kind of faded away. And the Jewish community was on the move all the time. So you didn't always have time to wait for the letter answering the question. So what happened over time is the Talmud, which is very open-ended in its approach to Jewish law, it was really started with Maimonides, with Rambam, and then it was to write what they called codes, the how-to book of how we apply Jewish law. So the first really accepted major source of this was the Shulchan Aruch, which is like again, a 20-volume set on every issue you could think about from Jewish law. But being that we're still Jewish and we're still complicated, it listed all of the laws for Ashkenazi Jews and all of the laws for Sephardi Jews, which weren't always the same. I mean, the famous one is, they eat Sephardi Jews eat rice and beans on Pesach. But all of the subtle, I mean, they aren't like, one can, steal and the other can't. But there are a lot of nuance of Jewish law that are applied differently. So that even became unwieldy to go through all of that. So then there was a smaller companion volume called the Aruch HaShulchan that pulled out just Ashkenazi law. So this became like the how-to book. Like, okay, so one source says your townspeople, but what about the animals? There's a debate. Like, how do we actually, we still have some questions about how to apply, certain things. So this is commentary on what we just learned about. First, you take care of your parents, then you take care of your siblings, then you take care of your town. Now, there is something fundamental about the details of the laws above that troubles me deeply. For if we explain the texts that I have cited according to their simple meaning, that certain groups are prior to others, they imply that one may distribute the entirety of one's tzedakah money to one group within the established hierarchy and need not give it all to those who fall outside that specific group, right? If your obligation is first to your townspeople, you can take all of your tzedakah dollars and just give it to your townspeople. That's what the text says. Your townspeople take precedence over anybody else. If there's anything left over of your family, then your townspeople. So you write one check to your town and you're done. But it is well known that every wealthy person, so now we're getting to people that have more abundance to give, has many more relatives who are poor. And how much more is that true for people whose charity funds are scant? And if this is the case, poor people without wealthy relatives will die of starvation. Now, how is it possible to say this? Therefore, in my humble opinion, the explanation of charity priorities is as follows. Certainly every person, whether of modest or significant means, is obligated to give a portion of their charity money to needy people who are not relatives. But to their poor relatives, they should give a greater amount than is given to those who are not related, and so forth on the ladder of priorities. Right? Like, hold up. Like, this may seem fair and equitable to say your first responsibility is to your family and your first responsibility is to your town. But what about all those people out there who have no relatives that can help them? And he's pretty blunt. Are they just destined to die of starvation? So no, when we're thinking about allocations, like, yes, you can give, the majority of your money to your needy relatives, but you must set some aside for other people. One of the things, and many people love it and many people hate it. People love to hate federation, but what are federations for, right? Federations are to collect this money and then, I don't know, I was going to say calmly, coolly, it's probably not always that calm and cool, decide how to allocate it. One of the things that our federation it did for rabbis, is they take us to, they did pre-COVID, we would go to some gut-wrenching place in Eastern Europe. I got to go to Vilna. You really haven't, experienced how depressing that can be until you're standing outside on a freezing gray day in the Ponar forest or Babi Yar and learning about, one day there was a rich community here, and 2 days later they were all, gunned down into this pit. And then they take you to Israel. And you visit all these sites and all of these needs in Eastern Europe, and widows who have nobody to support them and nobody has medicine and then they take you to these places in Israel that are doing this amazing, tzedakah work in Israel. And what they say is, after all of this, they lock you in a room and ask you what your donation to Federation is going to be that year. And at that moment, you're like, I'll sign over my firstborn. But one of the things that they say to you is something to the effect of, if we gave you, if you had $1,000 in your pocket and you went on this trip, you wouldn't have gotten to Israel with any money left in your pocket, right? You would have given, each group was so compelling in their needs, you would have given all your money to that group. And the time you got to the 10th or 12th visit, you probably would have had no money left. And that their point is, we look at it all, right? We look at it all, and we figure out, because we can see the bigger picture, how we allocate this. So it's not just based on the emotion of the moment. So many people now today say, well, thank you very much, but I can, regulate my own giving. Thank you very much. And I don't need you to do this for me. And I can decide where I want my money to go. And you should, it's good. But I support federation also, because my feeling is I can't always see the bigger picture. Should the money go? Well, I don't think Lieberman's part of the system anymore, but should it go to Lieberman, or should it go to Schechter, or should it go to certain things at hospitals, or should it go? So for me, it is helpful that there is an organization that's looking at the whole big picture here and in Eastern Europe and in Israel. But somebody's got to remember that there are people out there that have no relatives that are going to help them. And therefore, he doesn't like, as much as you have to respect these ancient sources, the idea that, well, wait a minute, this is not gonna, we have to think about this in a much bigger way than just the immediate, needs of the moment. So I think we have one more, and then we'll open it up. I don't know if I want to do that one. Okay, let's just do this one. This is a guy that I don't know if this is sort of Zach and his candy bar question of how could you possibly enjoy anything? So Elazar, and this guy I think they're mocking him in this piece. Elazar, the man of Berta, whenever the communal fundraisers would see him, they would run and hide. For whatever he had with him, he would give them. So this is, I think, supposed to be a humorous story, right? Because does anybody know that joke about the guy that's stranded on the desert island? This is an anti-federation joke. The guy, this joke, he's stranded on a desert, not the one about the synagogue I would never go into. He's stranded on a desert island, and he says to his friend, we're going to be rescued. Don't worry, we're going to be rescued. And he keeps saying, we're going to be rescued. We're going to be rescued. And he said, the friend finally says, why are you so positive we're going to be rescued? And he said, because I still haven't paid my pledge to Federation. So that's sort of the anti-Federation joke, right? Like they know where you are. There's another joke about that, about squeezing the lemon. I don't know if you know that joke. Two guys are in a bar and they're doing feats of strength. And one's like, I can squeeze this lemon and the juice will come out, and I can squeeze it. And this guy's like, I can squeeze this lemon. It'll just be dust. And he looks like a little weakling, but he squeezes lemon. It's just dust. And they say to him, what do you do? And he said, I work for Federation. So these are the jokes about, like, turning the screws on getting the money. So this is a crazy story, right? Who's running away? Not the person that has the money isn't running away from the charity collectors. The charity collectors are running away from the donor, right? This is just a farce. This has never happened in the history of the world, right? But they run away from him. Why? Because he'll give them everything, including his daughter's dowry. The charity collectors see him and they hide from him, but he runs after them and he says to them, I swear you must tell me, what cause are you busy? They answer, with the marriage dowry of an orphan boy marrying an orphan girl. And he said to them, I swear by the temple worship that those needy brides take precedence over my own daughter. And he takes everything and he gives it away. Then he gets some like wheat, and they plant the wheat and they have this bountiful crop. And he's like, nope, that's dedicated to the temple. So this guy is really set up, in our, it's funny, like you could see the story being told a very different way. There's a man in the community and he's so selfless and he's so wonderful that even the charity collectors don't want to take advantage of him because they know that he's going to give away everything. And he does. He cares about orphans as much as his own daughter, and he cares about donating to the temple more than, but that's not how our tradition chooses to tell the story, right? This guy looks like a jerk, right? He denies his daughter her own dowry. He denies his family wheat to eat. Everything is given away. And that's, I should have, I can send this to Zachary about the candy bars, but it's not considered a virtue to impoverish your own family in giving money to others. So I suppose part of what all of these sources are also telling us is there's a balance, right? There's a balance between taking care of your own, taking care of others, not impoverishing your daughter or harming her chances of getting married because you've taken away her dowry. Like there is a balance between how we figure out how to take care of the needs of others in a world where one must make choices because there are not unlimited amounts and resources to give. So while the ideal in creation ethics, the ideal would be, the ideal world would be everybody would have everything they needed. And then there's another world that would argue, well, you got to take care of your own family or even the Jewish people first. And then there's another word that says, no, you know what, you somehow have to figure out how to balance all of those things. And while you can prioritize certain things, you still have to think about those that have nobody to help them. And actually that is true. And they didn't bring sources about that, but there's an obligation to give tzedakah to non-Jews and to help non-Jews. So while you might prioritize the need of your needy community first, you also have to, in our tradition, take care of those that are in need that aren't Jewish. So with that, I'll just open it up if people have things they want to say or ask. Maris. But you're still muted.
There we go. Just sometimes it's complicated to give to your own family. I mean, it can be, there's something to be said by giving money and not knowing what's going to happen to it and so on. And I've studied Pirkei Avot, and they address some of this differently than this did.
Right.
So
Well, it's like hence the Yiddish curse, right?
Right.
Sometimes it's really hard to help your family members, especially you may know, I mean, not you personally, but you may know that they're doing things that you think are irresponsible with the money, even though they're still needy, so it's, you maybe it's that, too much. Mark.
There we go. In your example of the guy who gave away the money, his daughter's dowry and the things. So don't the rabbis see another side even of that story? Like, I mean, was he doing it to be a jerk to his family, or was he just feeling so gratuitous, that he had to give it away and thought his own family will,
Push it away.
no, they'll either that or they need to provide for themselves in the future or whatever.
I mean, I think this story is really set up as a sort of a moral tale about don't overdo it. Like, don't overdo it to the detriment, in not such ancient societies, women needed dowries. That's how they attracted husbands that were then going to marry them and provide for them. And so without a good dowry, he threatened her ability to make a good match, and for her to be provided for. What is that saying? Like, sometimes when you're kind to the cruel, you end up being cruel to the kind. So in overdoing it, like, I do think that's the moral message. Like, because you could say, like, he made sure that his daughter was taken care of, but at the same time, he also made sure that other people were taken care of. And that's not this story. This story is about a guy who's so compelled to give tzedakah and considers that the highest value that he can't see that he's harming his own family. And so you don't want to do that. Like, don't do that. Anybody else? All right. Well, tomorrow night is Purim. We're having a lovely Purim celebration at the synagogue at 6:30. I'm sure I'll say this tomorrow night, but Purim was our last communal gathering 2 years ago before COVID. We did, I think, we had one bat mitzvah after Purim. But after that week, I wasn't back in the synagogue so that was March. I wasn't back in the synagogue until October. And when I went to my podium, there was a Megillat Esther on my podium. I felt like to like dust it off. It was like an archaeological site with that. And so the fact that we're gathering, we are still saying that people have to wear masks, but we're gathering, and it feels good to think about gathering in person in a communal festive way after so very long. And then stay tuned for Thursday morning pop-up Megillah. We do have these beautiful new Megillat Esther books with great, like just commentary and introductions. And so it'll, you know, if your mind starts to wander, you'll have something really interesting to look at. So everyone, hopefully I'll see you for some of these festivities. And if not, I will see you next week.
Rabbi, can I ask you a
Yes.
question?
Oh, sure.
It's a off subject
Sure.
that you touched. What are your thoughts and what are your feelings about, you know, this conflict with Ukraine and Russia and Israel? And if you read different media sources, and not picking sources, they sort of are, you know, very critical of Israel, not, you know, wholeheartedly supporting Ukraine because of the security concerns that Russia's providing with. What is, you know, what are your thoughts, or what are, you know,
Yeah,
what is,
I'm sympathetic to Israel on this. I tend to be sympathetic to Israel on this. I think in the world of real politics, you can say what countries should or shouldn't do, but Russia's basically on their border. And they communicate for security purposes, and God forbid Israel should go in to try to strike Hezbollah and you know, shoot down a Russian plane, like that would be a disaster. Or Russia doesn't allow them, you know, closes the airspace to Israel and doesn't allow them to strike back against Hezbollah. Like, so I get Israel's position on this. I feel like, and I usually am not like this. What I'm about to say contradicts everything that I normally believe, because I actually think American Jews can and should criticize Israel. I think we have skin in the game, even though we're not citizens. And yet I feel like an Israeli citizen can critique their government. And I've read a lot of Israeli sources that they're very angry at the government. They feel that what the government is doing is immoral and they should be supporting the Ukraine. And I sort of feel like in this case, like they have the right as citizens to write that and to say that and to call on their government to act differently. And yet I feel like as an American Jew, I feel like not criticizing this, because I do see how complicated this is for Israel. And at the same time, Israel is taking in minimum 10,000 Ukrainian Jewish refugees.
and why do they not talk about that? I mean, you know, the free press in this country is basically so anti-Semitic, and you know they're taking the tone that's, you know, Israel is one of the only countries that hasn't supported Ukraine, and I haven't read anything.
And
in any
that's not
paper that
actually true. I mean, Israel has in the UN vote or whatever, Israel did, you know, didn't abstain.
Right.
So that's not really fair. I was actually shocked. Last week, Patrick Kingsley in the New York Times wrote a very favorable article about Israel at the border and with Jewish refugees. And I was shocked because Patrick Kingsley is, I think, an anti-Semite. And in his articles, in his political articles about Israel, refers to Israel not as Israel, but as the Israeli state, which is, I think, I mean, you don't say the German state, the American state, the Canadian state. And it reminds me actually of the Zionist entity. That's what it sounds like to me when he says that. And yet in this article, he called them Israel and he wrote very favorably. And I was like kind of shocked that the New York Times gave any kind of favorable press. And I haven't felt that the New York Times, which is my main news source, has been that critical of Israel. I actually think a lot of what's mostly critical about Israel are left-wing Israeli sources that are very critical about Israel. But it's really complex, like most things in the world are complex. I mean, I feel very torn about, you know, these planes and what our government should do about it. And on one hand, I feel like our own government should have said yes to this Polish deal and should have figured out how to get these planes to Ukraine. And at the same time, I really don't want World War III. And I started thinking about, you know, I started looking up how old were people when they were drafted into World War II, because I have sons in their kids in their 30s. And it's like, how would I feel about them being drafted? Like, how, like, where do I really sit on how far I want us to go? So you know, we're all asking those questions, even of our own government. I mean, Israel's one thing, but we're all asking these questions about how do we walk this line between supporting Ukraine and not being at war with Russia? Merle, you can.
Larry.
Oh, Larry. Okay.
So it doesn't really say in these sources about how we're supposed to live. You know, like, is there a limit on what we can spend and what we feel we should give away? Obviously, rich people live better than the poorest people. So how is that to be decided or controlled or?
I do think these sources give us insight. Like we don't impoverish ourselves, right? We don't impoverish ourselves, and we have choice within how we give, of, of thinking about how we support people. But look, it's very clear that we are obligated to give tzedakah. And in the Torah, it's like 10%, right? So, we have many sources that give us a lot of guidance. Funny, because I think when I taught this last time, somebody said, so where's the guidance in all of this? So we do have many other sources that specifically do guide us about giving. And obviously you can't bring every source. This is just a very, very teeny little sampling. But it's very clear in Judaism, we're obligated to give, and we're obligated to give, the best we can, but we're not obligated to impoverish ourselves or not help our own family members in need. And so those people take priority. And the sources don't say this, but I think about probably one of the biggest expenses most of us ever have are sending our kids to college. Right. And it's like, you send your own kid to college before you, what are the needs, right? What are the needs? But I don't know, your third or fourth vacation home, maybe not, you're sad, maybe not so much, right? And that's, we have such a different challenge, right, of what it means to live in an affluent society that are, there were communities in Judaism throughout history that were affluent. But on the whole, most people were worrying about how to put food on their table. So they had a hard time imagining the kind of abundance that we live with and what we need, what we think we need. My kids used to drive me crazy, and I've done this myself, but my kids used to open the refrigerator and say, there's nothing to eat, right? And what they were really saying is there's nothing interesting to eat. Like you could have eggs, you could have bread, you could have milk, you could have fruit, there's plenty to eat. There's just nothing exciting to eat. And it used to bother me when they would say that, because it's like, say there's nothing exciting to eat, but don't say there's nothing to eat, because there is plenty to eat. Deanna?
Go back to the Ukraine, Russia, Israel situation for a second. So I understand that Israel's in a challenging position, but doesn't the fact that Israel has taken the position it has, doesn't that allow it to have the possibility of being the one, or being in a position to broker type of agreement?
It'd be pretty amazing. That would be, I would love for that story. The Prime Minister of Israel mediated the peace process between Russia and Ukraine, like that, though. Well, I mean, that would be unbelievable. And that's sort of the claim, right? That Bennett was able to fly to the Kremlin and meet with Putin because he was seen as a more honest broker in the situation. And I suppose somebody has to be able to talk to that, maniac. Somebody told me, what did I hear this year or saw on Facebook, that this year we're not making Hamantashen, we're making Putintashen. It's the season between between Purim and Pesach. It's the season of crazy people who want to destroy other people. So we're we're kind of in the season to think about what does this all mean for history. So, but yes, I mean, listen, I can be plenty critical of Israel. I'm just not as critical this time, because I think it's super complicated and dangerous, and so dangerous. So, but I could see as a citizen being aggravated with your government, just or think your government is doing wrong. I mean, I think we could all make a case that the United States could be doing more, and we can make a case that the United States is doing exactly what it should be doing. So it's really hard to know. Anybody else? All right. Well, you know what? I felt this way on Shabbat. We had a lovely bat mitzvah, and it was almost felt normal. We weren't quite there, but it almost felt normal. And I thought, we don't celebrate because, the world is the way we want it. We celebrate as Jews in spite of the fact that we know that the world is on fire. but we still insist that we have the right to celebrate. And so hopefully that will be our tone for tomorrow night. And hopefully a great deal of gratitude that we even have the ability, to be together in a way that we haven't been able to be for 2 years. So, Deanna, I will email you Rabbi Gisa's email address. If you send me Becky's email, I'm happy to make the introduction between the two of them. She's not always so easy to get her attention, and the fact that she's going to be getting this the morning of Purim, or even, maybe later. So by the time Becky gets the information and reaches out, I'm not sure what happens if you just show up. So,
Okay.
all
Thank you.
right, goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.